We are now going to talk a little bit about the executive branch. In terms of the qualifications needed to be president, the Constitution really has three main qualifications or three requirements. One is you need to be 35 years old. Two, you need to be a natural born citizen. And three, you need to have lived within the United States for 14 years. Those same requirements apply to the vice presidency as well. Now, there are many more informal requirements, like having government experience, being a moderate candidate, and in looking at the past, most presidents have been white, married, and wealthy. Saying that, President Obama recently broke that mold in terms of being African American, and not to mention with Hillary Clinton running in the last election and Elizabeth Warren declaring her bid for the presidency in 2020. JFK was also an exception. He was the first Roman Catholic president. A lot of other presidents have to have financial backing because it's expensive to run a campaign. The Federal Election Commission, or the FEC, tracks how much money is spent in campaigning, and $6.5 billion was spent in 2016. Presidents also have to have leadership skills. They have to understand the public. They have to have a good sense of timing. They have to be able to compromise, and they have to be able to communicate. Let's look at their terms, their salary, and their benefits. So presidents serve 4-year terms. Originally, the Constitution didn't state how many terms. The precedent was set at 2 with George Washington, and FDR broke that precedent by running for 4 terms in the 1930s and 40s. The 22nd Amendment established the 2-term limit, which was discussed earlier. In terms of salary, currently the salary is $400,000 annually, with a $100,000 allowance in travel expenses and a $50,000 expense account annually. And looking at the vice president, the vice president has a couple of constitutional responsibilities. They are responsible for taking over the presidency if the president dies, becomes disabled, is impeached, or if they resign. The vice president also presides over the Senate and votes in the case of a tie. And the vice president decides if the president is able to carry out the duties under the 25th Amendment. Modern responsibilities include policy making, both foreign and domestic as well. And looking at the line of succession, the Succession Act of 1947 established the order of presidential succession. If the president is unable to meet the duties required of the office, the vice president would take over. If the vice president is unable to meet the duties, then the Speaker of the House would take over. If the Speaker of the House is unavailable or unable to fulfill the duties, then it would be the President pro tempore, followed by the various cabinet officers, starting with Secretary of State. In order to be elected, candidates must gather support in the form of PACs, or political action committees. They must then register with the Federal Election Commission, or the FEC, and participate in primary elections, caucuses, and national party conventions. Once they secure the party nomination, the candidate must win the general election. This is the election that is held in November. The president and vice president are not directly elected, meaning the people or the citizens of the United States do not directly elect those two. Voters vote for electors in the Electoral College, who then vote on the president and the vice president. Now, typically, members of the Electoral College vote how the popular vote in each state turns out. The Electoral College does that pretty much in every state except for Nebraska and Maine, because there is not a winner-take-all system in those two states. In every other state, there's a winner-take-all system where all electoral members of that state will vote for a candidate, regardless of if that candidate only won 51% of the popular vote. So presidential candidates need 270 of the 538 electoral votes. And the Electoral College has come under scrutiny as of late, especially with the whole winner-take-all system. Some argue that if a president or if a candidate gets 51% of the vote in New York and they get 80% in Montana, it really should be balanced in terms of receiving that many or that percentage of the electoral vote. Other problems with the Electoral College are third-party candidates. Sometimes they pull enough votes away from the two primary candidates where a clear majority is not granted or not earned. And then the last would be the election by the House. So if that 270 mark is not hit by any candidate, the House of Representatives gets to decide who the next president of the country will be. There have been many ideas to reform the Electoral College as well. Some say that we should do it like Maine and Nebraska and split the electoral votes based off the percentage of the popular vote. Other ideas would say we should assign electoral votes based on the national popular vote. Some say that they should receive electoral votes as they receive the state's popular vote. And some people want to eliminate the Electoral College altogether. So after a president is elected, they're going to be inaugurated in late January of the following year. Until that inauguration, they are known as the president-elect. They take office on January 20th at noon. And up until 1933, the president didn't take office until March. At the inauguration, the president has to swear an oath. I will read that for you right now. It says, "I do solemnly swear," or "I do solemnly affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States." The president is one of the few offices that requires an actual oath to be sworn by that person. In looking at the constitutional powers of the president, it is very vague. Article 1, which describes the legislative branch, really goes into detail in terms of what the legislative branch can and can't do. Article 2 simply states the executive power of the nation will be vested in the president. It doesn't list what they can and can't do. They simply must execute laws, veto legislation, command the military, engage with foreign leaders, and really it goes back to fulfilling that oath. They must do whatever is needed to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. They are also able to make treaties, appoint ambassadors, and appoint federal judges. With those appointments and those treaties, they do need Senate approval. And over time, the power of the presidency has grown through what are called inherent powers, or powers that aren't described in the Constitution, but have been claimed by presidents. And a few of those examples would be Thomas Jefferson buying the Louisiana Territory. The Constitution doesn't say a president can do that, but during the time, Jefferson felt it was necessary and important to the country to buy that territory. Theodore Roosevelt believed the president had the duty to do anything that the needs of the nation demanded, unless forbidden by the Constitution or by the laws. So if the Constitution didn't say something, the president had the ability to do it. Other examples include Abraham Lincoln suspending the writ of habeas corpus, raising an army and blockading the South at the beginning of the Civil War. He claimed that these were necessary to preserve the Union, and called a special session to Congress to get them approved retroactively. And he ended up getting congressional approval. FDR expanded presidential powers with the New Deal, and George W. Bush expanded presidential powers with the Patriot Act during the War on Terrorism. Presidents also have the power of executive privilege, which is the right of the president and other high-ranking executive officers to refuse to testify before Congress or a court. Washington and Jefferson both claimed this. Washington, during his presidency, had established what is called the Secret Service Fund, where the president has a certain amount of money they can spend, and they don't have to explain what it was spent on to Congress. And he invoked executive privilege when that was being tested in court. Jefferson claimed it during the trial of Aaron Burr in his debacle that happened within U.S. history. The founders also built multiple safeguards into the system by allowing presidents and members of the government to be impeached. So if a president had too much power or did something illegal, they could be removed from office. The president serves many roles as leader of the country, and the first of those is head of state. It's kind of a ceremonial figure. They meet foreign dignitaries, visit the scenes of national tragedies. They throw out the first pitch of the baseball season. They greet sports teams at the White House, things like that. They're also the chief executive, the leader of the executive branch, which implements the laws that are passed by Congress. They can also appoint, with Senate confirmation, federal judges. They carry out laws. And one of the limits of the presidency is funding, because Congress actually controls funding. So if the president wants money for something, Congress is able to limit his power through the funding that they provide. They can also issue executive orders, which are rules issued by the president that have the same force of law. So an example of that would be the Emancipation Proclamation, or it would be FDR using an executive order to intern Japanese Americans during World War II. The president can also impound funds, meaning if Congress grants the president to use funds in a certain way that the president doesn't agree with, he can simply, or she can simply, just not spend the funds. They can issue reprieves, pardons, and amnesty for federal criminals. Another role is commander-in-chief, where they're responsible for the nation's security and in charge of the military. They can ask Congress for a declaration of war. They can agree to treaties and diplomatic resolutions, leading to the role of chief diplomat, where they can meet with foreign leaders and appoint ambassadors, make treaties and executive agreements. They're also a legislative leader, because they're required to give an annual State of the Union message to Congress every year at the beginning of the year. They can call Congress into a special session when necessary. They can also veto legislation that Congress has passed. The president serves as an economic planner. They appoint economic advisors, meet with business leaders, prepare an annual budget. They have relations with the Federal Reserve. They have a council of economic advisors as well to help control and stimulate the American economy. They're also the party leader. They lead their political party, rewarding party supporters with positions and political patronage. This really began with Andrew Jackson, who not only got away from what past presidents had done, but he put his more loyal people into positions of government that he trusted. Now we're going to move into the president's cabinet. With that, there are many things to consider when choosing members for the cabinet, including experience in certain policy areas, administrative and supervisor experience, support for the president's goals, support from various groups that hold political power, and demographic diversity. The purpose of the cabinet is to advise the president and lead each executive branch department. And the role of the cabinet has really changed over time. Washington, for example, used all of his cabinet members' ideas for issues even outside of their own expertise because he wanted competition to come up with the best idea for solutions to problems. Jackson, he used what was called the kitchen cabinet. So he had his formal cabinet, but they didn't really get along most of the time. He actually replaced at least 5 members of his cabinet throughout his presidency, and he had a close group of friends in his inner circle that served as his kitchen cabinet, or it was like a non-official cabinet that people jokingly said they met in the kitchen. And Lincoln, his cabinet, he basically told the cabinet, like, hey, this is what I'm going to do. And the cabinet was more of just listening, or they listened and were informed on the decisions that Lincoln was going to make. That was really prevalent with the Emancipation Proclamation. So with the cabinet, you have various departments. You have the Department of State, Treasury, Interior, and the Department of Agriculture. The State Department, it develops and implements foreign policy. The Treasury manages the monetary resources of the country. Interior focuses on natural resources and minerals. Agriculture obviously focuses on farming and food. You have the Department of Justice, the Department of Commerce, and the Department of Labor. The Department of Justice enforces laws, their goal is to reduce crime, enforce civil rights, ensure that justice happens for all Americans. The Department of Commerce tries to focus on American businesses and trade as well as industry. And labor focuses on protecting and improving working conditions. You also have the Department of Defense, Health and Human Services, Housing and Urban Development, and the Department of Transportation. The Department of Defense focuses on the security of our country. I think Health and Human Services, Housing and Urban Development, and Transportation all kind of speak for themselves. You have the Department of Energy, Education, Veterans Affairs, which benefits veterans and their families, and also the Department of Homeland Security, which was created after September 11th. They protect against acts of terrorism. With the cabinet, you also have another group of advisors called the Executive Office of the President. This is supervised by the White House Chief of Staff. Included are the Council of Economic Advisors, National Security Staff, Office of Management and Budget, Office of Science and Technology Policy, Council on Environmental Quality, Office of Administration, Office of National Drug Control Policy, Office of the United States Trade Representative, and Office of the Vice President. So that was a ton of information, but you can see the president does have a lot of powers, and they also have a ton of groups of advisors in terms of the cabinet, as well as the executive office of the president.